Okay. Okay, well, welcome everyone to yet another Black History Conversations. I'm Liz Millman with some problems with my technology. Garrick Prayog's going to take over chairing the meeting because he can see what's going on, whereas I can only hear you. But I am here in Australia, so just acknowledgement of country. That's all I'll say this time. Over to you then, Garrick.
Thank you very much, Liz. So we have a couple of guests. Should we refer them as our guest speakers? So we have Juanita Cox. We also have Tayo Akula here to speak to us. So I think we'll invite Tayo firstly to present to us, and then if there's any question coming out of your presentation, Tayo, then we're happy to do that. Yeah.
I wasn't expecting to be making a presentation today.
Well, I say it in that way, but it's probably an introduction to to the work you're doing, and maybe you're able to refer to a couple of the points you made about art.
Okay.
Because I think that's quite important.
All right. How long do you want me to speak for?
Yeah. 20 minutes. 20 minutes is fine. Yeah. If even 15, yeah, and then we can raise questions to fill the time.
Okay, I think I'll see if I can get to 10.
Okay, carry on.
All right,
the floor is yours.
Okay, all right. My name is Tayo Aluko. I was born in Nigeria. I have ended up in Liverpool, where I used to be an architect until 2009, I think it was. And in that year, I decided to give it up and become a full-time performer. Since I was a kid, I was a singer. I started singing in my primary school choir, and I haven't stopped since. And when I got to Liverpool in 1989, a few years after that, and precisely in 1995, June 23rd, 1995, in fact, I was taking part in an event to mark the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. So at about 6:30 in the morning, I was at somewhere called Sefton Park in Liverpool, where the Friends of Sefton Park were holding a fundraiser, and they asked me to sing some songs. And one of the songs I sang, or maybe the only one I sang, was appropriately called My Lord, What a Morning, a spiritual. And after I sang it, a woman said to me, "You remind me of Paul Robeson. Do you sing many of his songs?" My voice is baritone, his was bass, much deeper than mine, but still I reminded her of him. And that was the first time I'd heard the name. But 2 months after that, I happened to be in the library looking for some book or the other, and then this book, Paul Robeson, jumped off the shelf into my hands, literally. I recognized the name, borrowed it, and discovered this absolutely amazing story. And I said, somebody's got to tell this story. And to cut a long story short, 10 years later, after trying one or two playwrights, I started writing it myself. And in 2007, I premiered my first play ever, titled Call Mr. Robeson. And that play has taken me around the world, and I'm still performing it today, 15 years later. And you can see behind me, there's a painting done by a local artist called Joe Ankara of Paul Robeson. So Paul Robeson basically took over my life. And his life story taught me African history. His father had been born into slavery, escaped, and ended up in Princeton, New Jersey, where Paul was born, the youngest of 5 children. But his father, who had been born a slave in North Carolina, taught his children the importance of knowledge of African history, pre-transatlantic slavery African history. So when me, as a boy who had grown up in Nigeria in a very privileged family, came to a boarding school down south in England for my sixth form, did architecture university, I knew the world wasn't right, but I didn't quite understand it. But one of the courses that I did in London, a course called Building Design for Developing Countries, was really my introduction to why the way the world was, because it introduced me to what had caused underdevelopment. And in that course, we learned things like, appropriate technology for environmentally conscious construction, but we had to learn about the vehicles through which certain countries became underdeveloped. And invariably, that was because of exploitation and theft by Europe of other people's resources, something which happens to this day. And like had always happened with the collusion of people of African people on the ground, still happening today. But their blame is only part of the story. I lay the blame, the majority of the blame at the greed of Europe and the white supremacy that Europeans seem to have imbibed into their souls. So in Paul Robeson, there may be maybe somebody here who doesn't know who Paul Robeson was, I don't know. But from that start, being the son of an escaped slave who got himself educated at Lincoln University and became a minister, but then lost his job as a minister due to racism. And so Paul actually grew up in poverty himself, but won a scholarship to this prestigious school called Rutgers. It was a small college then. He was the only Black boy at this time. We're talking 1915, 16, 17. But he then ended up qualifying as a lawyer, didn't practice as a lawyer because of racism, and then became an actor and singer, and became hugely famous. His only problem was that he was also a socialist and certainly a communist sympathizer, if not a even if he didn't join the party himself, to the extent that he and his wife sent their son to school in Moscow. But his politics wasn't a problem until the West started to turn against the Soviet Union after the Second World War. In the run-up during the Second World War, and the Cold War started. But he had always felt that the first time in his life when he went to the Soviet Union, he felt like a man with a capital M, like a full human being. And so he refused to join everybody else in turning against the Soviet Union, and got into a lot of trouble, to the extent that he became, from literally, and I think this is definitely true, the most famous American of his time, and popular. But an incident happened in 1949, which was what the authorities were looking for to pounce on him. And literally overnight, he became the most hated figure in the United States. And from then on, his career declined and he's been forgotten. So this boy that grew up in Lagos ends up finding this book. And so I and many other people are reviving his story to the world. Since writing and performing that play, which I'm still doing, I've written another one, Just an Ordinary Lawyer, which uses the life of somebody who was not famous at all, but a man called Tunji Showande, who was a Nigerian that came to England in 1945 to study law and ended up becoming Britain's first black judge. He wasn't particularly political, but he was first. And he used his position as the first ever black head of chambers to open doors for younger barristers of color to get their foot into the legal profession. And one example of one of them is a woman then called Kim Solaria, who's now Kim Hollis, who until recently was director of public prosecutions in the British Virgin Islands. So if not for Tunji Showande, she wouldn't have the career that she has today. She's now back in England as a King's Counsel in a barrister's firm in London. And there are others. Now, even though Showande was impressive compared to Paul Robeson, he was just an ordinary person. And that's not the reason I call the play Just an Ordinary Lawyer. I have a part of the play where he says, I became the first head of chambers, and these people wanted the WASU, the West African students wanted to throw a party in my honor, but I wouldn't have any of it. I was just an ordinary lawyer who wanted to do good. But the point about this particular play and this character who wasn't particularly political was that I wanted to tell political stories. I wanted to tell stories of history, of European colonization, slavery, etc. But more importantly, or most importantly, history of resistance. And so I introduced a fictional character who was the historian and the political radical who tells all the history. And so we have my alternative character telling us about the liberation movements in the Portuguese colonies, in the British colonies, talking about, and then actually what I haven't said is that Tunji Showande was passionate about cricket. So he just wants to watch cricket and sing songs. But the cricket and the play actually opens with him watching an iconic match at the Oval in 1968, the match at which Basil D'Oliveira was playing for England against Australia. And if he played well, he would be selected to go and play in South Africa for England against South Africa. The only problem was Basil D'Oliveira was born Cape Coloured in South Africa, and he was in England because he wouldn't be allowed to play in South Africa. So here he was in England to be picked to play in South Africa against the people who said he mustn't play. And that incident, he actually played very well, but he was not chosen. And so this is the kind of story that my character is watching. He's watching that match and that incident, which actually was the cause of the international sporting boycott of South Africa and encouraged trade boycotts of South Africa. Just one man quietly playing cricket. And then the next big sporting thing that he watches with his friend on the TV is the 1968 Olympics, where the African Americans did the Black Power salute. And I talk about the circumstances surrounding that. And then we go back and talk about people like Patrice Lumumba having been murdered and all those freedom fighters. And then we finally come to 1979, where there's another cricket match, a one-day international between England and the West Indies. And we talk about the great West Indian cricketers from the past. But the fact that this match was particularly charged because the England captain, Tony Greig, had talked about wanting to make the West Indians grovel. Tony Gregg being a South African himself. And it was at that series, or after that, that the West Indians started bowling at over 100 miles an hour. So through telling stories like this on stage, I am doing what Paul Robeson did when he said on radio that I use my art as my weapon in defense of my people and all oppressed people of the world. And so I tell stories like Paul Robeson's, people like Fela Kuti, the South Africans when they were dancing the Toi Toi, etc., etc. And I formed this talk, which I was going to perform at Edge Hill University, until my trade union call for solidarity put me innocently, I think, in the what's the form? Eye of the storm, between this battle between the university lecturers and the university authorities, because education, like medicine in this country, is now big business. And the thing about big business is you get as much money as you can and pay the people that work for you as little as possible and exploit them as much as possible. So that's what I've been doing. And here we are today. So tomorrow, as it happens, I've got my next performance. And that is a new monologue that I was commissioned to do, a 20-minute monologue to do with Black men and mental health. So there was a film made by two people, one of whom was I think, Togolese man living in Leeds or somewhere, who had been sexually abused as a child, and that had caused him mental health problems. And I can see my camera doing something funny. You can hear me still?
We can hear you, but we did see a few lines across the top of your head. That was the camera, yes.
Yeah. So this guy had mental health problems, but he sort of overcame it through dance, and he and a friend made a film which included other Black men who were talking about their own mental health problems. And then there was an open call to artists around the country to respond to this film. And I put in a proposal, which I called Dodging Bullets, which really talked about me being lucky to have avoided poor mental health. And so that's been performed once, and we're doing another performance in Leeds tomorrow. And that's me up to date.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that introduction of the plays that you're involved in. I just before I ask any question from the floor, one of the things that we've been doing for Black History Conversation is trying to focus on, how we define Black history. So we have British Black history. In your comments, you refer to African, prior to slavery. So there's the African history, and then there's the bigger picture of global history, and how we connect all of this together is quite important. But you focus on Paul Robeson. Now, we know he came to the UK. Can you just tell us? And the reason why I ask this question, because there's a specific reason for this. Which cities? Where did he stay in the UK? Where did he visit?
Yeah, he
in the north.
Yeah, all over. He actually lived in England between 1929 29 and 1939, I think. He lived in London, but there is hardly a city in this country or Scotland or Ireland that he didn't visit. So Liverpool, for example, he was here several times, and there are photographs and there are memories of him in Liverpool. One very interesting one, again, that I wrote about was in May 1949. I mentioned 1949 when I was talking about him before, where he something happened that sort of began the decline of his career. Which was he made a speech in Paris in April 1949 at the Paris Peace Conference, in which one of the things he said was something like, why should African Americans fight against the Soviet Union? When in the Soviet Union, that's where we're treated properly, and in America, we are second-class citizens. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly true statement. But as happened in the press, or as happens all the time, that speech was distorted. And they said things like, Paul Robeson says that he loves the Soviet Union more than his own country. That sort of thing. Anyway, on that tour of Europe, which included that Paris speech, in May, on May 7th, I think it was, he was in Liverpool. He happened to be staying in Manchester, I believe, came to Liverpool for a meeting, maybe Communist Party meeting or something or the other. And on the way, on the train, apparently somebody said, why don't you sing somewhere tonight, give a concert? And so, you think anybody will show up? Oh yeah, we'll fix it. And by that late afternoon, at somewhere which was referred to as the Blitz site, down Canning area, where Canning Street used to be, where Liverpool 1 is now. There were 100,000 people waiting to hear Paul Robeson sing. And there's a photograph of it. And I'll post the article I wrote about that on here. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for somebody to be able to draw such crowds at the drop of a hat, also to be so eloquent about talking about injustice and racism and peace, that person has to be got rid of, which is what happened to Paul Robeson. And in fact, I would say that 70 years later, that's the kind of thing that's happening to prominent figures like Bernie Sanders in the United States, who was so dangerous to the establishment that despite being Jewish, he was accused of being anti-Semitic at one point. And here in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, a danger to the establishment, absolute danger to the establishment, so much so that even the Labour Party MPs ganged up against him. And Keir Starmer stabbed him in the back and is now firmly planted in his position as the official second team of the Tory party, in my opinion.
Very interesting. And now we have the opportunity of, any question for Tayo in relation to what he said, or anything else that you'd like to ask. Sister June Elizabeth?
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I didn't want it to end. I know that Paul Robeson came to Northampton, as you said, he went everywhere, to the Royal and Derngate Theatre.
Okay.
But I am aware of certain people like Paul Robeson and people in our communities now, right, that you've mentioned a couple, globally, if you speak out, what happens to you, right? I just wondered. I knew what happened to Bob Marley, because when he went to Italy, he drew more crowd than the Pope.
Oh, wow.
So we won't go into that story. It was the CIA, how they put a nail in his shoe that had cancer on it. Right, we won't go into that story because I knew Bob Marley, but I always wondered, like Marcus Garvey, yeah, he's similar, and then in Jamaica they didn't want to know him, you know, because Jamaica's kind of been brainwashed, and then Marcus died here in Paddington. He was buried, and then later on, how much years later, the Jamaican government decided to make him a hero and exhume his body and take it back to Jamaica. But do you know how Paul Robeson died? I mean, I know I can Google it, but
Yeah.
you know.
Yes. He died at the age of 76, so he lived quite long. But the last 12 years of his life, he was in very poor mental and physical health. So there was a period between 1950 and 1958 when the government canceled his passport because they said Paul Robeson's travel abroad at this time would not be in the best interest of the United States government, which was a fact because he would talk wherever he went. He would make speeches from the stage. So during that time, he could not perform, couldn't record, and his income went down from $100,000 in the 1930s to $6,000 in the 40s. And he had one or two mental breakdowns. When he got his passport back in 1958, he immediately went on a world tour, which took him all the way to Australia, Caribbean, all over Europe, etc., the Soviet Union. He overdid it and had another mental breakdown. And he had one part of his treatment in the Soviet Union and more so in London included electric shock therapy. And his son, Paul Jr., was sure that the amount of electric shock treatment that he got was excessive, and he suspected it was on the instructions of the CIA. He was also apparently drugged a few times, again, maybe by CIA, nobody knows. But when he did his final tour in 1963 and got back to the United States, he was so unwell that he actually was taken to his sister's house in Philadelphia, and he lived being there with her for the last 12 years. And I've been to Philadelphia and actually stayed in that house. And somebody told me, this is a woman who would be in her late 50s, early 60s now, that she remembered walking past that house and seeing this old man in a rocking chair just staring out into the distance. And it wasn't until she was in her 20s that she realized that was Paul Robeson. And she wished she knew that this amazing man was that old man just sitting in the rocking chair. And so he just lived out his life, and in January 1976 he got a stroke, was taken to a hospital, and he died a few days later. And then, having been out of circulation for so long, when he was buried in Harlem at his brother's church in the AME church in Harlem, the church was packed, the streets were packed. It was like a god had died. All of a sudden, everybody remembered Paul Robeson and came to see him buried. So it is a tragic story, but it is one that is actually very, very inspiring. And for me, going through the kind of thing that I talked about going through right now, where I've had shows cancelled because I was showing solidarity to other trade unionists. I just remember what somebody like Paul Robeson went through, and what Dr. King and Malcolm X and Patrice Lumumba, I'm still alive. And I feel that I have no right to complain. And I just have to do what I think they would approve of me doing.
No, that's good. Is there any descendants in the family that is still alive, that pursuing any civil rights campaign at all?
The only person, Paul had one son, Paul and Essie, his wife, had one son called Paul Jr., who was born in 1936, and he died about 10 years ago. And I met him twice, I think. Paul Jr., he was an author, not famous like his father. He wasn't an artist like his father, but he was an author, and he wrote one or two things on civil rights and so on. He wrote biographies of his father. And Paul Jr. and his wife, Marilyn, had two children, one of whom died in his 20s or 30s. So Paul Robeson's granddaughter is the only surviving. I hesitate now because the word acknowledged surviving descendant living. So Susan Robeson, I think she's in her 70s now. I have also met her. It's sad to say that she does not approve of me, and at one point threatened to sue me if I didn't send her the script of my play. But that's another story, Now, I understand that her late brother, David, had a son who the family did not acknowledge. Whether he acknowledged him, I don't know. But apparently there is another Robeson Jr., whose name I don't know. He's around somewhere, probably in his 30s or 40s now. Another interesting thing is that Paul Jr., Paul's son, also in 1949, married a woman called Marilyn, I forget the surname, Ellsberg or something, but there's a white Jewish woman from New York. The father, Marilyn's father, refused to attend the wedding because she was marrying a black man. And 1949 was the actual height of anti-Semitism in the US. And so 1949 was just an incredibly traumatic year for Paul Robeson. And the number of things that happened in that year, I mean, I could only gloss over in my stage play called Mr. Robeson. But during lockdown, one of the things I actually managed to do was write a radio play, which concentrated on 1948, 49, 50, and all the incidents that happened in that time. And I call it Paul Robeson's Love Song. And in fact, maybe one day I can share it with you on this platform, because I put out notices saying that I'm going to share it, and then nobody shows up.
No, that would be wonderful. That's good, because the other thing we talk about on this platform is the resource that we acquire through these conversations, and that rich resource is available to education establishment, individual, academic, etc. We want to make sure that this information is not static. It does get used and benefit people, whether that will be further education, whether that will be higher education, or even schools. It's important that, this information is not lost. And, what you said about the two individuals you've been focusing on, it's only part of a bigger conversation about the struggles of Black and African people over the century. So thank you very much for your contribution, Tayo. And
Thank you.
course, I'm sure Liz will be happy to invite you back where we can talk about your radio play.
I think that would be very good,
I'm
Gary.
delighted.
Especially for our Windrush leading up in our conference,
Yes.
4 weeks. That would be excellent.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So thank you. And can I bring Juanita Cox in, because there may be some connection with what Juanita is going to tell us in relation to, because she's the historian that sort of connect Caribbean and African and British together. Juanita, invite you to give us a presentation, please.
Okay, so thank you for the welcome, Garrick. Just to say, Tayo and I have a lot in common, although I didn't realize it until now. And the first thing being that I was actually just going to join and listen to what everybody was saying rather than present. But Tayo, really interesting listening to you. I was also born in Nigeria and came from a kind of privileged background, came to the UK, boarding school, and then suddenly thinking, something's wrong with the world. So I completely relate to that kind of background. And really fascinating to hear about Paul Robeson. I'm always amazed that he's not kind of almost a part of our daily lives in a really strange way. And it's really lovely to hear how much of an impact he's had on your life. But he definitely made a stand on the UK, and there's almost like this strange kind of amnesia in that we don't kind of reflect enough, I think, on his contribution. And kind of, I like kind of activism through art. I find that really interesting. But so just to say to everybody here, because I haven't, I used to be more of a regular member of this forum, and I think I've been out of commission for a while. And the last time I was on, and I spoke to June Elizabeth, I think it might have been in November, actually. So I guess just to bring you up to date with the research that I've been doing on the Windrush Scandal project, for Tayo's benefit, just to say, I think everybody else is aware of what I've been working on, but I'm working on the Windrush Scandal in a transnational and Commonwealth context, and using archival as well as oral histories to kind of get a better understanding of the long history of the Windrush Scandal. And so two of my colleagues, Professor Philip Murphy and Dr. Rob Waters, are doing the archival work, where they are more focused on the 20th century context, the post-war period till about 1980. And then, because we don't have access to the archive, document archives or any papers from 1980s onwards, pretty much it's quite difficult to get hold of material that we might want to look at. Hence, that's where there's the real importance of doing oral history kicks in, but also really important in terms of understanding how policy actually impacts individual lives. And the way that a policy can look, relatively straightforward and innocent without people understanding the extent to which it can have a devastating impact on individuals and on communities. So that's what we've been kind of working on. And I think to date, I've done maybe nearly 30 interviews as part of the project, but with a lot more to do. And I've also got another colleague who's focused on the Caribbean context, looking at speaking to diplomats in the Caribbean to understand the impact of people being returned, but also why the Caribbean kind of accepts returnees, given that essentially they're British. And in fact, you know, the idea of sending somebody British to an area that to a place they haven't lived or been is kind of, well, it's preposterous apart from anything else. But I mean, it's to sort of understand what it is about diplomatic relations that means that they have no choice but to accept deportees, but also to interview people who've been locked out. So my colleague has been to Jamaica already. She's now getting ready, and she's in the process of going to Barbados. We found it harder to identify people who've been locked out in Barbados, but I'm sure there are some. So maybe it'll be a case of her kind of doing the research while she's on the ground there. But if anybody does know of people who can talk about their experience of having been brought up in Britain and then, you know, on traveling back to Barbados, then finding themselves locked out, that would be really useful. And just to clarify, when we talk about the Windrush scandal, I mean this in terms of, obviously, it's currently spoken about as though it's something that more or less happened with the Conservative Party from maybe 1910, 1930 onwards, particularly with the introduction of the hostile environment regulations and policies. But in terms of the project, we're interested, we kind of view it as something that's just been ongoing, that starts, well, I mean, we're using it as starting with the Windrush generation, although I think I've mentioned before, you know, Black people in Britain, I mean, Black people, Africans, people from the Black diaspora have had a long history, a long relationship with Britain. And if we're talking about the presence of Black people in Britain, I mean, that goes back to the Mesolithic period. So we had to choose somewhere to start looking at. And so we've chosen the Windrush generation, and we're looking at the post-war period. But that's not to say there haven't been these issues before, because as some of you or perhaps all of you will be aware, you know, you've even got cases that, you know, I'm trying to think of the Lord Mansfield case of 1772, when Lord Mansfield ruled that Black people couldn't be deported against their will out of Britain. You know, so it's almost as though we go from moment to moment where legislation becomes the sort of point of discussion around whether Black people can or cannot be British, have a right or do not have a right to be in Britain. But so since I last joined, I think in December, I've interviewed a few people. I interviewed, I think, Rupert Tanner, who works for the Islington Law Centre, but also people like Reverend Canon Christian Weaver, who I think was one of the founders of the Pilgrim Centre in Nottingham. So he's given us a kind of view of what this situation was like in the 70s and 80s in terms of people getting registered. But then we've also then, I mean, there's a kind of a cycle that I work as an academic where I'm always learning. So I'm always having to read around. Obviously, the project we're working on is not the first one. Two have been done on the Windrush generation, nor is it the first oral history. So I have to spend a lot of my time reading the work that other people have done. I'm currently reading a book by Mary Chamberlain. It's called Narratives of Exile and Return, and this is an oral history. Well, the particular chapter I'm looking at the moment is on the experiences of people who travel from Barbados to the UK. So there's always that, and there's always the need to do training, additional training on my skills. So in January, the beginning of January, I had to do data protection legislation training. Because inevitably when you're doing oral histories as a university, there's a lot of research ethics requirements, there's a lot of accountability to the community. We have to be very careful about the material that ends up being shared. And I say that in terms of we need to protect the people who are sharing information with us. So we need to think very carefully and thoughtfully about, you know, for example, if somebody with mental health issues relays their story to us, we need to think about the long-term implications of releasing that information to the public. will that come back to haunt the person who shared the story, you know, because of issues around public shame, you know, maybe when they're trying to get some great job 10 years down the line, will that be a hindrance? Do you know what I mean? So it's a very complex process doing these oral histories. And also the other issue is that in order to analyze the material, you then have to produce a kind of transcript. And so inevitably, if you do an interview of an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, that's many days of transcribing the material. So sometimes I'm around a lot in the community, and other times I disappear for several weeks at a time, because I'm actually spending time thinking about what I've been told, analyzing the material, so that by the time we get to the end of the project, we'll have a good sense of the wide range of varying experiences, the ways those, I mean, everybody we've spoken to, their experience has intersected with the law in a kind of different way. So it's trying to, you know, as part of the project, to highlight the real complexity of all of this, and almost the way that legislation acts as a tripwire. You know, you could get caught at this stage, get caught at that stage, get caught at another stage. You know, it's really complex. But so also what I do is, obviously, whenever I learn things, it's important that I then disseminate that to the community as I go along. So I've also been doing just small events. I did a reception, I think in December, with Glenda Caesar, actually, at the Westminster City Hall. It was called the Windrush Scandal, Know Your Rights. And Glenda was invited, I was there, and also Charles Morris, who was the Deputy High Commissioner for Barbados. It was a very strange event, because the Bayesian High Commissioner unfortunately didn't turn up. I think he got caught in traffic. Glenda ended up being about an hour late, so I ended up getting to steal the limelight and talk for an entire hour by myself, which actually ended up being really useful, because there was a lot of audience questions, and I think everybody got a lot out of it, including myself. The other thing is that I then also have to, I kind of think about, well, how do I use all of this to help decolonize the curriculum, I guess, in university spaces that are traditionally very white. So that often involves me traveling around to universities that don't have, you know, maybe their student body is very white, you know, maybe there's very few Black people, maybe they don't even look at Black history, that kind of thing. So in December as well, I traveled up to Durham University, and I did a talk called as part of their Stevenson Ideas series. And I have to say, I was utterly shocked to discover that a lot of people hadn't even heard of the Windrush scandal. And so it was invaluable. It was absolutely amazing. The students were horrified, I have to say. And clearly really interested in engaging and finding out more. And, you know, we're really keen on knowing how the public, you know, the general public could get involved in forcing the government to actually respond in a way that the British public could feel proud of. I mean, I think the overall sense was from having explained about the unfolding of the scandal, and then the government's response to that scandal, particularly as we've seen, it's been slow, but also in terms of the compensation schemes, the failings of that scheme, that they were really keen, one, to know about it, but also how to respond. And so I just think there's a lot of opportunity there to help activists kind of get a wider reach. I also did a talk recently at, this might have been it was in November, at Wolfson College, the University of Cambridge. And I have to thank June Elizabeth for most of her interview for the talk I focused on, because for that particular talk, I was really interested in, I was looking at the way kind of citizenship the way citizenship's framed in Britain, and the impact of the changing legislation on people's sense of identity. And when I'd spoken to June Elizabeth, she made some really powerful comments in the oral history interview about how she realized there wasn't a full stop. You know, she had gone through in the 80s and she had been at a meeting with Sir Ian Wheeler, and then, you know, he was saying, well, now things are like this, whereas they'd been like that in the past, and and it had a really strong impact on her. So I kind of then used that as an opportunity to talk about how these things, how legislation has a fundamental impact on people's sense of identity, but also how, in talking to June Elizabeth, that how I'd felt really uplifted by the experience of talking to June Elizabeth, because I could see how she had then managed to create a sense of identity, and was using her own agency to create that sense of identity by the work she was doing in the community, and also she took me to the burial ground in Northampton, where most of the family were buried, and then knowing that you know, these actual bodies in the ground became roots, really strong roots, to say, this is my place, this is my space, this is my history. And I really loved that as a way of showing, you know, that whole thing of oh gosh, the staying power of the Black community, and the resilience and the resistance and strength and all that. So that was wonderful to be able to deliver that to Wilson College. The other thing I've been doing is working with the Royal Mint as a consultant on their coin. So you know that they're producing a Windrush Generation coin. And just to make sure that the kind of historical information that they have and they produce as part of their publicity and promotions is accurate and on point, but also to help them find out, to get authentic material. I think one of the things that's difficult for organizations like the Royal Mint is to find images of people who came to Britain as part of that Windrush generation. And when I say that, I mean, you know, for example, we're all familiar with the standard stock photographs we get of the men who arrive on the Windrush, you know, but it's also just to remember that the Caribbean community is a very diverse community. I mean, you're talking about people from all kinds of backgrounds, not just African, but also Chinese, Indian, you know, and there were many members of the Windrush generation who have Indo-Trinidadian heritage, Chinese heritage. So it's about trying to make sure that they capture a broader sense of who Windrush is, but also ensure that women are well represented, because on the whole, I find that in the black and white photographs that we often see of people of that generation, it's very male focused. And also people forget that even on that Windrush, on the actual Windrush boat that arrived in June 1948, there were even children on board that boat. So it's about thinking and making sure that children are represented. And of course, it's very important to understand that in terms of the Windrush scandal, because it's that generation of people that's impacted are the children who came with their parents rather than the actual adults from that period. What else have I been doing? I recently interviewed Neil Mukherjee. All of you will know Neil as well. And that, I think he's the Windrush Commonwealth Services, CIC. That was also interesting because part of the issue around the Windrush scandal has been that the media focuses very much on the Caribbean community, and that's right. But of course, as we all know, other communities are affected, whether they're from Ghana, Nigeria, India, Pakistan. And it was really useful getting his perspective on the Indian communities based in Oxford, who also are struggling, but who are also responding maybe to the scandal in a different way. And I think what's been really fascinating about this study in some ways is because people from the Caribbean have a tradition of activism and resistance and resilience, they're actually really good at mobilizing in a way that perhaps other communities are more respond to situations like this in a different way. So having spoken to other people, we're finding that because of the work that the kind of Black British Caribbean community are doing, it's enabling and providing a space where other people can also secure assistance and help, which they might not otherwise have got. So yeah, just to say that organizations like Garrick's and the work Windrush, Jean Elizabeth does, the Windrush National Organization, there's so many Windrush groups, but all doing absolutely invaluable work that if wasn't being done would mean that other people from other communities may not have got any help at all. So that's been a kind of interesting outcome. The other thing we've been kind of looking at is thinking about particular aspects of British legislation. So things around, for example, this kind of criteria for people to have good character. We're really interested in this clause that keeps popping up about, is the person conducive to public good? You know, so the fact that we're getting a lot of people who are on indefinite leave to remain, you know, they want to retain their Jamaican passport, so they've got indefinite leave to remain, but they're also British, you know, but then they maybe commit a crime, and then for whatever reason, if the crime is over, they get sentenced to over 1 year, they're then kind of deported. And they're deported on the basis of them not being conducive to the public good in Britain. And so we're really interested in that really long history and where that comes from. And there's a lot to indicate that it's hitched around eugenics. I mean, it's this idea of the health of the nation, and the idea, apart from the fact of essentially wanting to keep Britain white as far as possible, you know, there's this kind of, yeah, I mean, it's something that we're mulling over at the moment, but it seems there's a lot that's concerning us in terms of this idea about the health of the nation, the idea, or these ideas that are rooted in the best way to keep this nation healthy and strong is to get rid of criminals, people with mental health problems, people. So whenever the opportunity arises to do that, it's done. And it's, you know, if we think about Britain in terms of its long history, that's connected as well to the fact that it had penal colonies. You know, it had Australia, you know, it got rid of its own people when it could. Do you know what, if you understand what I mean? So it's, and of course it used to deport its own kind of political dissonance, people who didn't agree with, you know, orthodox politics, that kind of thing. So those are the things we're sort of looking at, and or loosely looking at, things I'm looking at that I find interesting, that I think will eventually kind of feed in to the project in one way or another. The other thing that I've been doing, I don't know if many people are aware, but I spend about 1 day a week at the Black Cultural Archives. One of the things that's important as part of this project is to kind of go through other oral histories that have already been conducted by other people to see what can be found. So I go through all the material in their oral history archives, particularly because they have a lot of archives on activism and oral histories with women that have been involved in activism in the Black community. And that's been insightful as well, in the sense that you get a sense of what was going on, you know, maybe in the 70s and 80s, but in particular because they've got a Stella Dancy archive, and the material in the Stella Dancy archive is paper archive, but it's absolutely invaluable. And you know, there are documents in there, and I'm having to kind of corroborate some, I'm having to look for supporting material when I think about this, but I found something recently that was talking about the 1971 Immigration Act, and how people had been called forward to register as British, but almost 40% of those who went to register as being British were then had their applications rejected. And I don't understand what that means. So that's now something I'm going to have to look into to try and understand, well, you know, on what grounds, well, why would have they been rejected? I mean, you know, you call people to come forward, you say it's anyone who's been here, you know, pre-1971, blah, blah, blah. But what's interesting as well is to see that it was the community that was most attacked during that period appears to have been the those who came from the subcontinent of India. So it's also interesting to think about how some communities, you know, there's almost like a hierarchy of communities, like we're seeing here in the UK today at the moment. You know, if you're from the Ukraine, come in, we'll support you X, Y, and Z. If you're from Hong Kong, we'll support you in this way. If you're from Afghanistan, you know, so there's communities that there's almost like a hierarchy in terms of the way that people are treated. Yet if you're from the Windrush generation, well, you know, you may be homeless, but we're only going to give you this amount of compensation. It's really kind of interesting to think contextually, yeah, across that really long history, and just see how what is going on politically globally that's creating these kind of differential dynamics. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, on the other side, you know that I also run an initiative called Guyana Speaks, and so just to point out that we will be doing as part of our usual monthly forum, we're going to be doing a particular talk on Walter Rodney, looking at his kind of kind of the history and the ideas that he espoused. So if anybody wants to sign up for that in March, please do. The link, I've put the link in there. But also to say that this year is the 200th anniversary of the Demerara uprisings in 1823 that took place in Guyana, and are seen as being one of the key kind of rebellions that eventually led to the emancipation legislation. So I'm trying to find a way to kind of recognize that history with the university. So we're looking at the university's archives at the moment to see what material, what primary material, what letters exist from the white colonizers that were there that refers to the rebellion, and then to think about how we can use that material creatively for the diaspora here, but also for the university back in Guyana. We think that kind of material should be accessible to the University of Guyana, which it currently isn't. So yeah, and I guess the next stage of the project is we've got a conference coming up on the 19th of June. We actually also tried to see if we could get some funding for it, because we haven't got any funding for it within the, you know, the pot that we got to do the actual project, but we couldn't apply for it under the Windrush grant scheme because you can't do anything political, and as far as we're concerned, you can't talk about the Windrush generation without being political. I mean, the whole history of the Windrush generation is political. So we found that very strange, but anyhow, I've managed to, that took me a little while. We've now managed to get the funding for that. And it's very much going to be focused around not only the Windrush scandal, but just talking about compensation and reparations. But the evening event is going to very much be a celebration in which we're going to have John Agard, who is a poet. And so we hope to make it something that people will be interested, the general public will be interested in attending. But the kind of the shape of it is yet to be properly formulated. So as soon as I have an idea as to exactly how it's going to be shaped, then I'll update everybody and invites will be sent out. And then finally, yeah, the next stage, the next stage of the next few months will be to try and secure interviews with MPs that were involved in the Windrush scandal, particularly people I mean, this might be wishful thinking because I know their schedules are absolutely horrendous. But people like David Lammy, Diane Abbott, Belle Ribeiro Addy, Kate Ossamore, and I'm sure I've forgotten a few other names, but yeah, there's a few people that we see as being critical to the project, primarily, obviously, because of their response. I guess one of the things we're really interested in looking at is looking at so, if we think about how the legislation impacted the community, we're also interested in how the whole scandal got forced onto the political agenda, and understanding the mechanisms that kind of were involved in terms of, whether it's the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that took place in April 2018, but also the involvement of MPs, church elders, lawyers, charities, all sorts of different people, just so that we can really be able to preserve that period of history from the perspective of those who were involved in that period of history. But yeah, so that's pretty much me. I don't know if I've probably gone on too long.
No. That's wonderful, Juanita. I mean, your work is so diverse, and there's so many facets to your work, and there's never a dull moment in your research. There's always uncovering different bits of information that sort of make the picture a little bit better. But just two questions, because I just wanted to, something you mentioned, which has been said before, Lord Mansfield case, for example, back then, that piece of legislation, is it of no value to us today?
I mean, so much has happened since then that it's a bit like, the 1948 Nationality Act meant that everybody coming from the Caribbean was British, but then some legislation comes along and then changes that. And the problem is that, it was useful for a period of time, but things have since come along and changed that. And to be honest, one of the biggest problems, as I see it, in terms of the law as it currently stands, is it's so complex that things almost have to go to court in order to work out what the law is demanding. What does the law want? Because that was the problem with the Lord Mansfield case. It had been this idea that could you actually be a slave in Britain? There'd been previous legal cases before that one saying, yes, it's legal to have slaves in Britain. No, it's not legal to have slaves. Yes, it's legal to deport. No, it's not legal. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like the arguments just continue on in court. And, it's based on the last kind of ruling, but then that may change depending on, slightly different case and different rulings. So
yes, yeah. Just before June Elizabeth comes in with her question, the other point, towards the end of your presentation, you spoke about interviewing MPs, and you referred to all the MPs that you referred to are Labour MPs. And I'm thinking, if we're gonna, in terms of the oral history and the conversation in the recording, can we record some of the Conservative MPs and even those MP who have, has moved from the House of Commons to the House of Lords, because they would have obviously have a wider timeline knowledge for the last 40 years or so. Can we interview any of those?
The project is very much focused on capturing the Black perspective and capturing the perspective of people who are supporters of the community. So I guess, we could, but I hadn't thought about it in that sense, because we know pretty much what, if you go onto Hansard, we know what the discussions are going on in Parliament. You can just do a Google to find out about the debates that are going on around yeah, the legislation. But I'll have to think about that. It's
It's almost as if they're
point.
divorced, isn't it? You know, they're the guilty party. It's almost they're divorced from all of this. You know, you're collecting and, you know, information of people's experience, but some of those people are the cause of the experiences.
Yes, but I think the thing is, because the project is the project doesn't answer all questions about the Windrush scandal. What it's looking at is the alliances that are created in order to. The project comes from the position that the government, there's been a dereliction of responsibility on the part of the government, that the government has behaved in a dishonorable way. It hasn't supported people who are British in the way they should have done. So it comes from that standpoint. So it means, therefore, that what we're trying to do is actually look at, had it not been for all these key players, you know, we're interested. Who are the key players that actually then helped to support the community and then forced it onto the political agenda? So we see people as David Lammy as being key to having, you know, he was there when they had the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting with Patrick Vernon, with people like Guy Hewitt, the Bayesian High Commissioner. Those were all people who then helped to force it onto the political agenda. And so I guess it's because of the way the project is looking at who forced it onto the political agenda. That's why it's mostly focused on, because obviously the Conservatives, you're looking at people like Amber Rudd who pretend, you know, everybody's pretending there's nothing wrong. You know, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, no, there's no problem here, even though, you know, people from St. Kitts, from Jamaica had all approached the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office and said, look, we're concerned. There are people being deported back who haven't done anything. Why are they being deported back? Oh, don't worry, it's a one-off, it's an anomaly, it's not, there's no pattern to this, it's, you know, and then Amber Rudd, no, there's no plan to get rid of, you know, Theresa May, no, there's no problem here. So we know what their standpoint was, we know what their views are. And what the project's interested in is the people who helped to ensure that despite all of that, it got then forced onto the political agenda, and the people who then helped to ensure that some of the wrongs are being righted.
Yes.
And those are the voices we want, because what we know is that the voices of the people who are in power are the voices that will be recorded. Do you see what I mean? It's always the voices of the people in power whose voices are recorded, but it's those who aren't in power that we don't necessarily know about, particularly from the 80s and onwards. So I understand what you're saying in that it would be good to have the Conservative viewpoint, but their viewpoint will be preserved for posterity and history anyway, because they are the people, the movers and shakers who are in control. But I'll think about it. I mean, I get where you're coming from, so it might be something to think about a bit more deeply.